Rebecca Koskela, and I am one of the co-leads of the Metadata Interest Group. So I think there's been a little bit of confusion, so I'm just going to outline how things work. So Jane and I started out, I'll show you a timeline. In fact, I'll go there next. The timeline. So Jane and I submitted a proposal to the very first RDA meeting, and we were a candidate working group. But what got approved before the candidate working group was an interest group. So the way the metadata group is working now, there's an umbrella of a metadata interest group. It can spin off working groups. The very first working group was the Metadata Standards Directory working group. The second working group, and that's the one that you're being asked to review the final report on, was a Metadata Standards Catalog working group. So those were two different working groups. And as you can tell, Jane and I submitted a long time ago. That was in 2012, actually, but it was finally approved in at the end of 2013. And we got our work done on time, which I think is great. And we also added 2 more co-leads to our group. So the co-leads of the group are Alex Ball from the UK, Jane, Keith is also from the UK, and myself. And I'm in the United States in New Mexico, and Jane is at Drexel. So here's some history on what we did. I went over the timeline probably too fast, but what I wanted to point out was FAIR had not been introduced at that point. The findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable had not been introduced. So you have to think back into the time frame in which this was done. And so the reason Jane and I were first interested in this is that I was working with the Data One project at the time, which was a 10-year NSF funded project that was one of the data nets that was intended to make all the data that had been funded by NSF findable and usable, but that hadn't come into play yet. That was coming in 2016, but we're still back in 2013. So one of the things Data One did is that they had done a survey, a very large survey of both. It was a global survey about trying to figure out if researchers wanted to share their data. And one of the questions on the survey was, what metadata standard do you use? And that graph down on the bottom with a really tall one was, they don't use metadata standards at all. And the second one was my lab, whatever they came up with, that's what they used. So Jane and I thought it would be really good to put together a working group to actually address this about what metadata standards should you be using, and also people had a hard time figuring out where to deposit their data. So that was another thing that we were going to work with. As we were putting this together, we discovered that the DCC, and Kevin's here on this call, had already done a metadata catalog that was terrific. And we thought, okay, well, never mind, it's already been done, we'll just stop. But it turns out that the DCC didn't have the resources to continue to update the catalog or keep it going and add new things and things like that. So the whole purpose of the Metadata Standards Directory Working Group was to bring together and make available to people, from a human point of view, being able to read the different metadata standards from all the different disciplines: environmental science, geology, bioinformatics, computer science, everywhere. And the group also had members. We had 163 members, and they represented many, many countries, which was nice because then they could bring to this directory all the standards they were aware of. So what we did, so the deliverable from the Metadata Standards Directory Working Group was a a website where people could come in, they could add new metadata standards, they could correct metadata standards, they could add use cases. So for each metadata standard, there's a link to the standard, there's who uses it, how they use it, and some examples. So it's a fabulous resource. And so what this does, it's a GitHub site with that had a nice interface on it. And then when the work that was submitted was accepted, it was passed on to the, I'm sorry, it was passed on to the DCC metadata catalog so they could continually update it. I think part of the problem was that this was one of the first projects that actually created software and a website, and it didn't fall into the category of a recommendation, which would have been like a PDF of some sort. Like, we recommend you do this and this. It was actually a working product, and that could have been part of the confusion. But anyway, it was accepted by a lot of things. So the two adopters at the beginning were the DCC, the Data Curation Center, and the Data One project. Okay, so those were the two. So there was the DCC and Data One, and the GitHub directory. What's interesting is we still get quite a few visits to the GitHub directory. What it does now is, this was for human readable people, but the next project was machine readable. So in addition to those two adopters, and the two other places adopted it, this was the Social Science and Humanities Open Cloud, and also the Barcelona Supercomputing Center for improving the Copernicus Climate Data Store metadata scheme. So as a follow-on, we created another working group, and this was going to provide machine readable, and so that you can actually use an API to get to all those things. In addition to keeping that functionality of updating, adding to, or correcting existing standards that were out there, descriptions of them. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but what I wanted to let you know is that first product, it was an evolution of things to come, sort of a phase one, phase two, with the first one being human readable, and the DCC catalog is still in existence. People can still go there to find the metadata standard that they should be using, could be using, and it refers back to the RDA solution if they need to add something or correct something. So we have now had a machine readable catalog of the metadata standards. Two versions of it are out, and we've actually retired the existing GitHub one, and all things now go through the RDA metadata standards catalog. And we continue to get new questions all the time. We get new metadata standards, and also new use cases. When people are looking for what metadata standard to use, it's really helpful if they can see the use cases and how people have used a particular standard. And that would be it. Jane, did you want to add anything?
No, I think you covered it fairly well. I mean, fantastically, Rebecca, really. Just to say that even today, I refer people to the RDA directory and the DCC one. I would say probably at least once a month. I got somebody, and sometimes more than one person saying, I'm looking for a metadata standard about X or whatever. And I know I'm an iSchool professor, information science, data science, that I use it every semester for teaching students about the whole range of data, metadata standards for research data. And so, and I mean, it's still quite useful. I just think we got caught in having, as Rebecca said, we were one of the first 6 groups. I think there were 6 groups. So I see Hillary nodding. Anyhow, I don't think I can add anything else, and maybe it's better to open it up and see if there's questions, but thank you, Rebecca.
Yeah,